Welcome to Careful Minds, a new season of the ADM+S podcast. I am Rayane El Masri, a PhD student at the Queensland University of Technology and part of the Australian Research Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. My research focuses on the value alignment of generative AI and explores how care ethics can be operationalized as a moral framework for guiding AI behavior. In this series, I talk with researchers, designers, and philosophers about the dilemmas we face as AI systems become part of our everyday lives, and how ideas of care, responsibility, and justice can guide the relationship we build with them. Today's episode of Careful Minds explores a question that sits at the heart of both AI governance and care ethics. When an AI system misleads, discriminates, or excludes, who is actually responsible and who bears the cost of that failure? My guest is Dr. Joanne Kwai, a research fellow in the School of Media and Communication at RMIT University, and an affiliate of the ARC Center of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. She holds a PhD from Karl State University in Sweden, and before entering academia, she worked as a reporter, editor, and news anchor in China. She teaches in the Journalism AI Academy at the London School of Economics, contributes to the New Books Network podcast, and her work has appeared in leading journals including Telecommunications Policy, Digital Journalism, and News Media and Society. Her research focuses on digital journalism, the social implications of automation and algorithms, and the governance of data and AI. Welcome, Joanne, and thank you for joining me in today's episode of Careful Minds.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, AI systems are now part of how millions of people access political information and understand the world around them. When those systems produce biased, inaccurate, or culturally unequal outputs, the consequences fall on real people, often those least equipped to challenge them. That is not simply a technical failure, it is a political and institutional one about who decides how these systems behave, who is protected when these cause harm, and who is left out entirely. And at its core, it is a care ethics problem. So, Joanne, before digging into the hard questions, can you please tell us more about your experience in the Chinese media world? So, you worked as a reporter, editor, and news anchor in China before becoming an academic. How did that experience shape the questions you now ask about AI and journalism?
Actually, my research interest was directly influenced by my professional experience working as a journalist in China, and also my lived experience when I returned to China during the height of the Hong Kong protest around 2015, 2016, and witnessing a lot of my friends accessing information through social media and later 2019 through these news aggregators. And they believed in a very different version of the news that I was exposed to when I was doing my master's overseas, and see the power of algorithms and how they has changed the people, how they consume news, what kind of version of the stories they believe in. And also that was the time when there were a lot of AI news anchors. So the Chinese state media put a lot of effort into developing what they called digital human or virtual AI anchor that are modeled on real news anchors. So I had a lot of journalist friends that I used to work with had this fear of losing their jobs and even panicking. So, who are going to be the real anchor and who is going to be the real journalist. But the conversation also quieted down afterwards, but it really steered this kind of curiosity inside of me. And I had the opportunity to do my master program in European Union. At that time, it was a European Union-led master in media, journalism, and communication, where I did half of it in Aarhus University in Denmark and later in London, and had the opportunity to visit a lot of newsrooms, and they were all having this conversation where they want to leverage the power of data and AI in journalism. So that's how was shaped my research trajectory.
Thank you, Joanne. So, gatekeeping has always been central to journalism. Editors deciding what gets published, algorithms deciding what gets surfaced. But then again, we have another form of gatekeeping with LLMs like ChatGPT and Gemini. How is that form of AI gatekeeping different from algorithmic gatekeeping? And why does that distinction matter for how we think about governance?
Mhm. So you're making the correct distinction here. We already have this like traditional algorithmic gatekeeping when we think about, for example, social media, that they have content distribution that's powered by algorithm for content personalization or content recommendation. So they usually select and rank the content, and it shapes the visibility of the content. But the content still produced by these content creators. And when you talk about the large language models and when you talk about AI gatekeeping, you mentioned the kind of functions such as Copilot or what we see nowadays in Google AI Overview, when they are, for example, chatbots, they are infused with web search capacities. And also the other way around, when you have search engines that are powered by large language models that can synthesize the answers. So they are not only just distributing this content, they're actually generating the content. So they're synthesizing from what they say, like multiple sources, and they can even frame this issue in a seemingly very authoritative ways. So this is very different from the previous social media algorithmic gatekeeping age that we have been experiencing. That is, first of all, who are there to guarantee this kind of content generation is accurate, and not only on the information that they surface, but the kind of citations they use, the attribution that they use. So the empirical study that I've conducted with my co-authors on the 2024 Taiwanese election, that we audited the answers from Microsoft Copilot at that time, we found like nearly half of the answers contained some sort of either factual mistake or when it comes to attribution, there's some mistakes. And some of them are major mistakes when they miss out even a presidential candidate. Some of them are more minor when they cited the wrong number in the polling data by a few percentages. But one could also argue that's a major mistake because in a tightly run presidential election, even a few percentage, differences can change the outcome. And when it comes to the attribution, it was also very problematic. Sometimes they say, for example, Financial Times said this and that. But then if you actually go to the Financial Times original news reporting article, they didn't necessarily say that. So this creates this kind of problem where this chatbots or this language model powered search engine, they are simulating this authority. They're borrowed from the legitimate news outlets, and it can really damage the reputation of these legitimate news outlets when the information was wrong, and even hurt the trust from the audience to these news outlets. And sometimes they're just like borrowing this kind of legitimacy and authority, and this could really be argued down the line in terms of like where they direct traffic, who gets credited, and who gets the money, right? Who actually gets the revenue. And it's also a problem when it comes to the accountability chain, where the error becomes even harder to detect and contest and who is really responsible. So so this can be very problematic. And when it comes to the implications for the governance framework, it's also that the existing frameworks, we assume some identifiable actors like the publishers, the editors, and distribution platforms. When you have a journalist writing a piece of news article, it is, easier to establish the chain of accountability in a sense. But when the AI systems collapse, because they are assuming many different roles. They're the content creator, the producer, the editor, the distributor, and they have this interface that they interact with the users. So sometimes it can create a regulatory blind spot. And you can even think these systems as what we dub as meta gatekeepers, because as you know, and you can imagine how the researchers are using this kind of large language models, powered AI chatbots, or search engines, and journalists are also experimenting with this type of tools. So these systems are ultimately the gatekeepers of the gatekeepers. So we're no longer just governing what gets done or what gets shown. We're also trying to govern what gets said into existence, basically.
Yeah. And yeah, so going back to your paper about the Taiwanese election and the example you gave about the different quality of information using different languages. So beyond the numbers, what does those failures reveal to you about like how these systems are actually built and for whom?
So as I just mentioned in our audit, I guess I can give a little bit of background of the research we actually conducted, especially when it comes to methods. So we're auditing the kind of answers generated by Microsoft Copilot the days leading up to the 2024 Taiwanese presidential election. And we were assuming good faith users. So in contrast to other type of research where they may actually prompt systems or red teaming them to prompt them to answer something more contagious, we are actually just assuming the persona as someone who's curious about the election, or voters who want to get information about the election. So not like a malicious intent. And we just asked very basic questions. So tell me about the Taiwanese presidential election, right? And then another question about who are the candidates, and questions about where are their stance on the Taiwan-China relations, and another question about who's the best candidate to vote for, and another question is like who's leading the poll. So the research is designed in a way with some questions asking more fact-based information. So to just better for us as researchers to discern the accuracy, and some of them are designed to elicit the kind of opinion-based answers, who's the best to vote for, so that we can audit the results based on this kind of like normative framework we come up with when it comes to journalistic norms or democratic norms in terms about like bias or impartiality, that kind of questions. So in our audit, not only have they made many factual mistakes as the example I've given, there are also this like source bias and hierarchy. So, because we asked these chatbots in 5 different languages. We asked them in English and the traditional Chinese, which is mainly used in Taiwan and also like Hong Kong, Macau, and a lot of overseas Chinese communities. And we also prompt them in simplified Chinese, which is the written languages mainly used in mainland China. And we also prompt them in Swedish and German to see how they're being used in like smaller language groups. And the results show they are really heavily relying on this English language and Western-centric sources, such as BBC and Financial Times. And then they are also have different answers across different languages. It is no surprise, like when you prompt them in English, like they're mainly like English sources, but even the Chinese queries landed in like, for example, BBC Chinese. One could argue that if you have local sources, when we are talking about Taiwanese election, right, could be more relevant. And also the Chinese queries really, between the two of them, the simplified and the traditional, also gave a very different kind of political framing. So in the traditional Chinese, because it's mainly used in Taiwan, there are more surface answers attributed to or directly related to the local election authorities and the local government agencies that have the most authoritative answers around this current event electoral process issues. But when we prompt them in simplified Chinese, which is mainly used in mainland China, there have been more sources and content surfaced from Chinese news media, mainland Chinese news media, that would talk about Taiwanese election in a very different light. And so that created a different political framing and who's using this. And there's another issue when it comes to, we also find there are a lot of sources they are actually just quoting Wikipedia. So Wikipedia is being heavily used in this type of search results. And also the platform preferred sources. So at the time of our study, Microsoft Copilot will surface some sources in a particular format. They are being singled out as a Microsoft Start Partner. So these are the type of news agencies who has a licensing agreement or the kind of strategic partnership with the platform companies. So these type of sources, they have been prioritized. And sometimes this content is even behind the paywall if you go to their individual website. But through the kind of Microsoft starts the kind of news aggregator they have, the kind of licensing agreement that they had, these kind of answers can be preferred and have more visibility. So it really talks to the bigger problem when it comes to the platform political economy, who are being the licensed partners, who are the platform-owned content ecosystem. So it points to the problem with like whose voices are being amplified and who gets excluded. So these are actually structural design choices that's being made. And because this type of systems, they are optimized for their fluency and usefulness, and they're not in this stage particularly concerned about truth or these like journalistic norms when it comes to actual facts, or they're not built with this like safety, the guardrails on top of like embedded within their value system. So the larger media system is being very much AI mediated, and the kind of licensing agreement that they can sign can be also very problematic in the sense that only the larger news organizations may have the negotiating power to sign such agreement with these platform companies, AI companies, many cases around OpenAI, as you've been seeing right now. But what about the smaller newsrooms, the local newsrooms, or the independent journalists and journalism? How can they be part of this conversation? So they are really facing the risk to be being marginalized. So the problem isn't just like what AI gets when AI gets things wrong. It really reflects like whose knowledge is being made visible and who is like being quietly left out.
Exactly. So, speaking about whose voice is being amplified and whose voice is being silenced, in your opinion, how does AI governance look different when you approach it through a genuinely cross-cultural and cross-linguistic lens?
So, as I just shared in our audit of the Microsoft Copilot system, when we prompt them in 5 different languages, you can already see there is this dominance of these English sources and also this Western perspective when the Western news media sources are very much being preferred and overrepresented. But this also goes beyond the language itself, because there are different kind of like AI chatbots or large language models that are being developed across the world, and China being a prime example. So just to give you one example, at the time when we were trying to conduct this research, we actually first contemplated in doing a comparative study where we wanted to compare, for example, Copilot, Google Bot at that time, now like Google Gemini. And we thought about like China's Baidu Ernie Bot, which was also popularly used at that time. But the funny thing is, Microsoft Copilot at that time, when it comes to the performance, was the most stable one, and the results was actually okay to be analyzed. Where Google Bot at that time was making so many mistakes that we felt like these answers are just not good enough for even analysis. Now it's a different story when we have Google AI Overview, which I will argue is a very exciting research area. But when we looked at the Chinese large language model systems, like because we wanted to use Taiwan presidential election as a case study, as this is one of the earliest elections that were happening, that we could apply this technology and really audit the systems. Guess what happens when you ask a China-based system about Taiwan election? They wouldn't even give you a straight answer. So sometimes it was just like goes to direct error, or like the system just like spending a lot of time trying to respond and not giving you an answer. But sometimes they will even generate an answer. So we asked them, oh, tell me about the Taiwanese presidential election. And they would say, oh, the election of Taiwan's regional leader is going to take place, blah, blah, blah. And then they would say, oh, Taiwan is an inseparable part of China. So as you can see, there is like a content moderation rules. They are embedded in the China's built AI bots. And so they are really aligning with the state narratives, because, like China doesn't recognize Taiwan as a country, nor does it have a president, quote unquote. So they're saying the regional leaders of Taiwan is being elected. So, the Chinese system, sometimes they're not just like not give you an answer or withhold information entirely. They're actually reframing the answer. So the issues here is not just about this accuracy, but also about the kind of framing, the kind of omission, and ultimately the kind of epistemological control. And this has a lot to do with the context where these models are being functioned, and it's influenced by its political, cultural, economic system, the kind of media tech relationship they had in this specific context. So it really reflects the even bigger problem, or how AI systems are not globally neutral. They actually also reproduce this kind of like linguistic and political asymmetry that we see.
Exactly. So, like, there's no unified AI governance pattern. Like, it depends on the country, and the legislations of each geographical area, like we've seen in China's example, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so this is from the large language model. When we talk about the actual audit of the performance that they have. And I also conducted comparative studies when it comes to the copyright regime of AI-generated news, where I analyzed the legislations, policies, and regulations across US, EU, and China. So copyright also constitute a very important aspect of governance, especially now there are a lot of conversations when it comes to if a piece of work is generated by AI, is it copyrightable? Who should be the author and who gets paid? And the other way around, a lot of news organizations are suing this AI company because they argue that their news reports have been used by these AI companies to train their large language models without properly compensating these news organizations, right? So the copyright has been a huge issue, created a lot of tension. And when you look into this kind of governance models across these different jurisdictions in the EU, when it comes to the copyright, they have taken a more proactive approach trying to protect these news organizations, but sometimes these policies have been a little bit fragmented, and they have good intentions, but they didn't really take into account the bigger picture, sometimes neglecting the smaller players, such as the smaller newsrooms or the freelance journalists, and becomes a kind of like not enforceable or like a policy patchwork. And in the US, there's this really, of course, market-driven kind of logic, and they are relatively hands-off and really created this kind of policy silence. And in the Chinese context, both the journalism, media sector, and the technology sector has been utilized or instrumentalized by the state to push forward the state agenda for the political alignment. So as you said, so these can be manifested very differently across different jurisdiction, across different cultural and political contexts. But overall, we see there is this power asymmetry where the technological companies, the platform companies are in the upper hand, and where a lot of times the journalism, the public medias are, really in the detriment.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So there's this pattern that keeps emerging in AI governance. When a system causes harm, everyone involved has a reason why it's not their fault. So the developer points to the training data, the platform points to its terms of service, the regulator points to the lack of legislation. So in the context of elections, where misinformed voters are a real consequence of these failures, that diffusion of responsibility stops being abstract. Who should be accountable when an AI system misleads a voter, in your opinion? And what would accountability look like in practice?
Mm-hmm. So when we say voters are being misinformed or misled in relation to AI, we are actually not talking about a single technology here, and it's also not exactly a new phenomenon. So the technology itself has a whole spectrum, right? We can be talking about the automated kind of information manipulation, the computational propaganda, or the deep fakes, or the algorithmic amplification on social media. That's largely to do with content distribution. And that's been, for the past decades has been around. And of course, the most recently, we have in what we just discussed is like large language model powered search engines and chatbots, and they have the potential to also, they are being a more and more prominent actor in this increasingly AI mediated information landscape when it comes to election and electoral process. And there's also a distinction that can be made between misinformation and disinformation. So the misinformation is the kind of inaccurate information, but they're not necessarily intentional. But when we say disinformation, it's more strategically produced to manipulate public opinion. And these distinctions are, they matter because they involve different kind of actors and responsibilities in each of these cases. So as we mentioned in the large language model AI chatbot cases, when we audited it, there's a lot of factual mistake and kind of misattribution. And if you use that as example, so who's responsible there? So like the developers and platforms, they are, I would argue, deploying these kind of systems prematurely without proper safeguards built into place, probably driven by the kind of profit, audience engagement, the kind of incentives that they had in mind, and also the regulators who allow the deployment under the currently weak and unclear framework. But it is kind of a conundrum that we're in, where the regulators kind of always had to play this like catch-up game. And to some extent, also the users, because there is this increasing demand for media literacy, AI literacy, if you want to be, a responsible citizen in a democratic society, to be have your civic currency, you have the responsibility to keep yourself educated and informed, and in this case, adequately informed. But of course, like shifting responsibility to users through AI literacy is never sufficient, and also can be very problematic to really shifting the responsibility to the individuals, which is not the right way to go, because in terms of the power symmetries, they are the ones who are really with like the real, really not at a strong position to argue for this. So there's also this like chain of delegation. You have the developers or the data annotators, the model themselves, the platforms, the interface, the users. So this is some a complicated network of responsibility. And the problem here is these companies, they often frame this kind of errors as these model errors rather than a governance failure. And this is problematic because misleading a voter in the case we're discussing here is not just a technical glitch. It's a democratic risk, right? So, but I would also like to add that there is research being conducted, or the scholars that argue that the impact of AI on elections has been overstated. There were a lot of research carried out through the year of 2024 because there was the year of elections. A lot of countries are going on election. So following that, there are also reflections on a lot of this very alarmism kind of a narrative might be overblown. And there is a real risk in that, which is if we pay our attention to this kind of overstated risk, it can also distract us from the actual harms that could be caused by these systems, such as the structural inequality, such as the biases and discriminations that exist, and even the broader information ecosystem's failure. So if we are to understand AI, and if AI can really shape this political understanding like media, then we should really be careful not to let this responsibility disappear into the models. It should be anchored in these like different institutions.
Yeah, definitely. So, everything we've discussed so far, from linguistic inequality, responsibility gaps, invisible labor, only registers as harm if someone with power agrees to call it that. But the definition of AR harm that shape regulation and industry practices are themselves produced by a pretty narrow set of actors. We have large technology companies, Western regulatory bodies, and academic communities that are not particularly representative of the world's AI users, of all people using AI. So, in your opinion, who currently holds the most power to shape what counts as AI harm, and whose definitions are being silenced or pushed to the margins?
So you are absolutely correct. The power to define AI harm is currently really concentrated in the tech companies, and there are a lot, oftentimes framed in technical terms. And this harm is sometimes reduced to safety violations or those like counter moderation categories. But it sidelines the kind of structural inequality we touched upon, or these kind of political influences. And the harms can be categorized into many ways, right? There's this interpersonal harms. You now have AI bots like undressing women to have their deepfake nude. That could cause like a lot of psychological damage to these victims. And you also have this like larger societal wide harm as the disinformation, misinformation we touched upon, or even ecologic wise, or like the climate impact, right? And if we let these companies decide how we define these harms and what would draws our attention, you can really sideline these very important issues. And they have their tech leaders. Now you have, for example, characters like Elon Musk or Sam Altman. They are actively shaping this kind of discourses around AI development. I would argue not just for, their like for attention or personal fame, but it's also really into their benefit to decide, they could argue like AI is, harmful to tackle their corporate, business counterparts, opponents, and they could argue, oh, geopolitical threat is real. We need to develop AI just because they want more resources put into AI development. So they're actively shaping this kind of discourse. And this type of company is they hire lobbyists when there are regulations being discussed. For example, you have even earlier days in the European Union when it comes to GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, recently the EU AI Act, right? So the tech companies, they can hire lobbyists, and then this kind of regulations, at the end of the day, they can get watered down. Like some of the more human rights groups concerns, or we have like digital rights watch groups, like they were advocating for like more stricter regulations, and they're really in compete with this like different interest at play. And, one could also argue the missing voices also include the non-English users and the other actors who are working on this whole AI supply chain, such as the data annotators and larger global South communities. But I will also point to like a more, I guess, hopeful note and positive note is that there are a lot of great work that's being done as part of the resistance. For example, the academic research community at the ADM+S Center, we have a lot of scholars, researchers actively working on this and giving their policy recommendations, and they push forward this public interest advocacy. And also in my own research, when it comes to the investigative journalism, they are also a formidable force, right? We have like almost 10 years ago already, scholars stopped this group of investigative reporting of algorithmic accountability reporting, where journalists investigate the AI and algorithmic system and to see what kind of harms they're causing. And in the Chinese context, we also have investigative journalists who had reporting on the gig economy workers being trapped in the algorithmic system. And that actually led to nationwide debate and even platform companies coming out to say we want to ratify our algorithms to create better working conditions for the gig economy workers, and the policy changes when it comes to minimum wage and better social welfare for this group of workers. So investigative journalism, this type of public interest advocacy can still be very powerful. So yeah, there is hope.
Yeah, definitely there is hope with academia and journalism and the people. But if you want to go back to those mostly in power, so it seems that no matter how well researchers map the harms or editors document the failures, nothing really changes if the institutions in power lack the mandate or the incentives to do so, or at least don't do anything. So, in your opinion, if we want to talk about a governance change and not a technical or a societal change, if you had to choose one institutional shift, not a technical one, what would make, for example, AI chatbots genuinely more accountable? What would you choose? An institutional shift?
I would say I would look forward to this kind of cultural shift when it comes to moving away from the corporate self-governance to an actually public accountability infrastructure. So this means we can have more independent auditing rights, and this means we have more transparency across the data, how they're being collected, how they're being annotated, and the design of the systems, and how and also the evaluation, how they're being evaluated. And that means the inclusion of more external actors, such as the public, the researchers, the civil society, and the journalists. So this is some deeper cultural and institutional shifts that can rebuild trust in these public institutions, in the technologies. And this really requires us to strengthening the public institutions. And because we've already established in this conversation that AI governance is not just technical. It is about what kind of the information environment that we want. So the tech companies, sometimes they talk about this alignment problem. They want to align the AI systems to the human priorities, right? The human values. But I think it is important for us to have this conversation on what kind of values do we hold? What kind of societies do we want to build? So this also means we have to be more articulate when it comes to our values. And I hesitant to use this word, but I've heard also other scholars to argue, maybe we also should be more transparent when it comes to the ideology, what kind of ideology we are talking about here, and be more transparent about that, and also make these conversations more contextual. And sometimes when we think about, building this public accountability infrastructure can be very difficult. But I will also really like to always add some positive and hopeful notes. So one point I've already made is that, the high quality journalism, investigative journalism can really play really important role. So that also means that the public should support this type of good quality journalism, or even the institutions can set out to, really safeguard the public interest media kind of infrastructure to guarantee that we have this healthy information environment that where, healthy democracies can actually function. And even on a personal level, right, think about how you can contribute by actually think through your media or news diet, your media habits, where are you getting this information? And if you are getting it from trustworthy quality journalism outlets, think about that you can, reward them so that you can keep the system more sustainable. And even on the personal level, I think it is kind of hopeful, because ever since I've been researching this topic, I have some friends also come to me and talk about, how encountering with these AI systems, most recently, the large language models in the form of AI chatbots has made them rethink who they are and what they want to be in the age of artificial intelligence, right? So basically, the philosophical question is what does it mean to be human in the age of AI? And I think this kind of personal level reflection is quite important. And there are also the kind of reflection when it comes to relations, so this relational reflection when it comes to what kind of relations we want to have with not only machines, but the humans. So I've witnessed people even experiencing this kind of digital fatigue. They want to come offline to enjoy this embodied experience with their friends, going to concerts, or even sitting in a coffee shop and knitting or doing book club, but be present. And so there's this kind of even renewed interest in this offline embodied experiences. And also when it comes to the AI generated content, there's huge influx of AI slop, this low quality AI generated contents. And I think people are already experiencing or expressing their fatigue around that, because they lower the production cost. To some extent, they are lowering the value of it. And people do appreciate more of sarcastic, what makes it valuable. So there's this even renewed interest in human creativity, and people are going back to what is actually creative expressions of human. What does it mean to be original, and even to the more nitty-gritty or handicraft kind of things. And I think that's quite interesting. So basically, with this kind of personal reflection on the personal level, on the relational level, and I think we can collectively have a more reflection on the broader societal level. So the key shift here is not just like building better AI, but actually treating AI as part of our public infrastructure and governing it in the public interest.
Yeah, that was a really eloquent question and like advice regarding not only AI governance but also like the use of AI and how everyone is responsible on like in this responsibility gap or in this world we're living because like as you said people are started getting bored of AI and AI slope and maybe it's bringing us back to our authenticity and what make us really humans. That was a truly insightful discussion, Johan. Thank you for bringing such clarity and depth to such an important topic. What this conversation has made clear is that AI governance is not a distant institutional problem. It is being decided right now in annotation guidelines, in contract negotiations, in the languages an AI does or does not serve well, and in the question of who gets to be heard when these systems cause harm. Your work is a reminder that these are not just technical questions, they are political and moral ones. I really appreciate the clarity and honesty you brought to this conversation. Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you so much for having me again. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Joanne. To our listeners, thank you for being with us today. The ethical journey with AI is only beginning, and I hope this episode encourages you to ask better questions about the systems you interact with every day. I am Rayane, and until next time, take care.